Thanks to those folks who are trickling in. We're going to give it a couple more minutes because we did have quite a large list of RSVPs. So we'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes from now. Thanks. All right, folks, we are going to get started. Thank you so much for your patience. We wanted to wait a few more minutes as folks trickled in to our session today. Thanks so much for your participation. We had an incredible list of RSVPs, over 300, and I can see about 80 attendees currently in the room to join our discussion today. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us in this fireside conversation entitled Fireside Conversation, Philanthropy, Business, and Rights. So we all know that this decade since the guiding principles were adopted has been a busy one, with activity from civil society and social movements, the development of robust sectoral standards and monitoring, industry-led approaches, and government efforts. So this tent of business and human rights has grown seemingly quite large, and this growth has been met with a corresponding uptick of philanthropic actors grant-making into this space. But to date, these actors have remained sort of behind the scenes, prioritizing the voices of their partners and in the forefront of the agenda. This fireside conversation seeks to draw back that curtain a bit more to understand how some of the leading philanthropic voices and actors in this area are prioritizing this decade for action on business and human rights, the trends that they're seeing and the voices that they wish to highlight from the field, and from analogous fields of worker rights, climate justice, and corporate accountability. We'll also hear how philanthropy is organizing and orienting towards action going forward. My name is Amol Mehra, and I'm the Director of Industry Transformation at the Laudes Foundation. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today as your facilitator in this fireside chat. And I'd like to start off in our discussion today by welcoming opening remarks from Anita Ramasastry, who many of you know. Anita is a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and today was obviously the first day of the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, and we are proud as members of the philanthropic community to be supporting and partnering with the UN Forum on this event. So Anita, I'd love for you to open up some remarks about, have you seen this decade of action, and particularly what your thoughts are on the role of philanthropy in the fight? Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amol. And again, of course, philanthropy is an important part of the ecosystem, right? And can be important partners for many civil society groups and other actors, researchers who are in this together. We are a network, but as I think Amol said, sometimes what happens in terms of the philanthropy space, especially for newcomers or people who may be focusing on one issue but are needing to shift, may not understand what the priorities are of the philanthropic community. So first of all, I also send my greetings. I'm here in Geneva at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, which launched today. And we're really pleased that we have such a great group of presenters to speak about their work and their organization's priorities in this space as part of the forum programming. And so glad to see so many people who've joined. What I would like to say, first of all, is that I hope that we can repeat this in future years. I think that this sort of level of dialogue and transparency and really leveraging the platform of the forum to get the message out and have this kind of a dialogue is really valuable. And perhaps next year we can include some people who've been on the recipient end in terms of donor funds to talk about their projects, and maybe people who have been new to this world. And I think, as I'll say, normally we would be sitting in the Serpentine bar at the UN sipping coffee, and many of the individuals who are here today representing their organizations would be meeting with potential grantees and having these discussions. But I think the question always is, some of the other participants at the forum may not know who they are. And some of the participants at the forum may not know how to get on their calendar, how to have those discussions, and what the priorities are. So why the working group is very happy to sponsor this as part of our next decade work. We launched our roadmap for the next decade of business and human rights is because, number one, we do want to have that greater transparency and more dialogue to provide access to more individuals who may be seeking funding. We hope that this will be beneficial to both recipients of funds, but also to philanthropic organizations as well. So that's one. The second is that, as we heard much today, the agenda is getting bigger, right? That the agenda, and as you've heard from Amal, is not just business and human rights anymore. It's also about worker rights. It's about just transition and climate justice. It's about gender. It's about inequality. And so the question for me to all of the speakers today is, how do we weave in the classic business and human rights and corporate accountability agendas into these larger agendas? How do you do it? How do you make priorities? And what does that mean for the business and human rights agenda as we need to sort of flex our muscles and sort of deal with this bigger agenda? That's, I think, really important, and hopefully we'll have that discussion today. And I think the third is really for those people who are new to this discussion and this dialogue and may not have had those connections or be part of the inside network as it appears. How do you get started? And really, what does it mean if you have a compelling idea to do this? And how does the donor community, how do philanthropies actually combine and pool their resources? Do you divide and conquer, or are you leveraging your work together? And I know that there's some of that, with Forge and others in terms of actually collective action on the part of philanthropists. So just as we're saying collective action for civil society, are we seeing collective action in the area of philanthropy in terms of leveraging your resources? So with that, I'm just looking forward to listening today. Thank you so much, Amal, for putting this together. It's our pleasure to be partners in this dialogue.
Wonderful, Anita. And as you do so well, you foreshadowed many of the themes that will come up in the discussion today. So thank you for being with us and for your leadership on this agenda and as part of this community more largely. I see people are already putting out comments in the chat. Please use the chat function, everyone. We have a great group of philanthropic leaders also in the chat that we just couldn't fit into the screens of the panel. I see members of our colleagues from Humanity United and others in the room too. So put your comments in there and we'll try our best to weave them into the discussion as we go through today. And again, yeah, thank you to Anita for that. So I'm going to make a pivot here with Anita's good questions and framing. We're going to split the next sessions up with our panelists into groups. So what I've asked is sort of 2 panelists per question to come together to frame up their sort of interventions on that. And at the end, we'll then ask each of them a sort of a fire round of questions to get us to the close of the panel. But first things first, I'm not going to introduce everyone. I've asked everyone to take 2 minutes to tell us about who they are, their role, and the focus of their philanthropic work. This is, again, another fire round for you to get a flavor for who's looking at you in these screens. And then, of course, please feel to use your own fingers in Google to find out more. And the emails for the panelists here today as if you have any questions after this event. So I'm going to start by just looking at my screens. Karen, would you mind just telling us, who you are, where you are, what your focus is of your work, and we'll just power through everyone, and then I'll move to my first panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Amal. So my name is Karen Keenan, and I'm the coordinator of Forge. Forge is a funder collaborative. It's funders organized for rights in the global economy. That's the Forge acronym. And in addition to all of the organizations that you see represented on the screen in this webinar, and everyone will introduce themselves and their organizations in a moment, Forge also includes Fundación Avina, Humanity United, and the Ford Foundation. And they're not on our panel, but as Amal said, I think many or not all of them are in the chat function, and we may hear from them as we move through the webinar. Forge is a collective that's focused on promoting economic justice. And by that, I mean preventing and providing appropriate remedy for harms that are suffered by rights holders as a consequence of economic structures, economic policies, and practice, And that includes the practice of business, of corporations. And I'll talk in a moment about how we attempt to do that. And we'll connect again to some of Anita's questions. But in just a moment, that's who I am, where I work, and what our objective is.
Fantastic, and great modeling for that. Greg, I'm going to pass it to you, and Daria, you're up next.
Great, thanks. My name is Greg Guignol from Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. I've been at Wellspring about 4 years. Previously, I was at Business and Human Rights Resource Center for a number of years. I'm based in New York City, to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Mannahatta and the Munsee Lenape people. Wellspring has done some funding on human rights in the global economy for a number of years, since before I was here. We have a real focus on accountability in particular, and developing standards that will help close the gap in accountability, frankly, that we know that corporate actors and financial actors face. And that can take a range of forms, obviously, around both developing those norms and enforcing them, as well as just helping to build the field, recognizing that really it's not the foundations themselves that should be leading the strategies, but that should be seeding a strong civil society field that's able to protect human rights, respond to rights abuses, and help obtain remedy. And I can say more. I'll say more about that when we get to it. Thanks so much for organizing this, Amal, and it's great to see everybody here.
Daria, over to you, and Camille, you're on deck after Daria.
Thanks, Amal. It's great to be here with everybody today. So I'm Daria Calaguer. I'm the director of the Sagefund. Sage was launched in 2015, and it's a collaborative fund that comes out of and is firmly rooted in the human rights field, but works cross-field. So environment, labor, women's rights. So, and Anita, thanks for that launching point, that launching question, because to your point about how does the business and human rights agenda get incorporated and dealt with in this larger set of issues that Karen was distilling around economic justice. So for us, the framework is human rights in the global economy, which includes not only businesses and corporations, but investors and the state as an economic actor, and then recognizes the ecosystem that operates between them. So it's not just targeting the actors, but looking at the structures and system and policies that enable all of that. So the way we don't have a geographic focus, we work on cultivating strategies. So working with groups in the field at different levels of the field, often in partnership, to cultivate strategies to strengthen accountability. So to Greg's point, and we do that in a sort of an R&D kind of opportunistic way, and we work, as those of you who know us, we work in a way that's a bit experimental. And the idea here is to really partner with groups, be prepared for things not to work out, but to learn something from it and try to launch. And so strengthen strategy development in the field, and then also use that kind of R&D role to bring those issues, opportunities, and approaches to funders. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Camille.
Thanks, Daria, Anita, and Amal. Thank you so much for inviting us into this space. I'm Camille Malik, the Executive Director of True Cost Initiative. We sit in Boston. And at True Cost, we try to highlight the true costs of corporate enterprise on the environment and on people's lives. We have a strong belief that right now the cost of corporate enterprise is being felt in form of land, life, and livelihood. We're a very relationship forward funder. That's the feedback we've gotten from our partners, and we believe that that is one of the most honest things that they could say about us, and it's a real privilege to sit in that space. We're known for speaking very plainly. We take partnership very seriously, and we ultimately try to use the privilege of philanthropy as a bridge to speak truth, and also just to speak hard truths. I really like the circumstance that you set us up here in a fireside chat, and I think that's good. We should be warm and cozy at a fireside, but we should also be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit of heat under the collar, because we're accountable to partners. We're accountable to the people who we are entrusted with providing support and funding to, because they're the ones doing the hard work. And some of the things that we focus on, like Sage, we don't have a global particular region that we focus on. We support groups from all across the world. And we really try to entrench ourselves in supporting technical expertise and support, which often goes unfunded in the corporate accountability and funder space, supporting different forms of advocacy. And we really believe in collaborations, just like Forge, which you'll hear a lot more about because we really believe that's a way to kind of move things forward in the funder space. Thank you.
Wonderful, Camille, and indeed, let's get into some of that heat on the back of our necks. I love that. John, and then Ellen, you'll close us. So John, over to you, and then Ellen, to do your introduction. Please, John.
Hi, everyone. Camille, you're always a hard act to follow, but I will try. Look, thank you to everyone who's organized this here, to Anita, to Amol, all of the other Forge members that are co-sponsoring with us. I'm John Jacoby. I'm based at Open Society Foundations. I'm in the Washington, D.C. office. And in my case, I spent the last 6 years as a program officer developing and then leading a grant-making portfolio around business and human rights and corporate accountability within the Human Rights Initiative at OSF. Going back a bit further, I mean, my work over 20 years has been really at an intersection of the issues that we're taking up here: economic actors, policy systems, especially business investors, and then how they cross-cut with human rights, social, economic, and climate justice and sustainable development issues. So, in my case, I've been able to work across a few different kind of settings within the .org arena. Philanthropy is one, obviously, advocacy and operational NGOs another, and so in my case, Oxfam, and also think tanks and academia, such as the Center for American Progress. In terms of the focus philanthropically for us at OSF, our mission is in our name, Open Society, and we define that as advancing human rights, democracy, countering authoritarianism and corruption to make governments responsive to and inclusive of and accountable to their citizens. So what we are doing as OSF at the moment is resetting our own strategies and structures, how we go about advancing those same goals in the world several decades on from when we started, and in a particularly tough last 5 to 10 years for some of these issues, where we find ourselves more on the defensive than in the beginning of OSF's lifetime on advancing human rights, democracy, rule of law, and the like, and then to see how we can be fit for purpose in this very pivotal moment in this very decisive decade. So on business and human rights, our approach has been to focus about geographic balance, to make sure we have political and financial influence in our field, and then to advance a focus on an issue relevance, especially by increasing our emphasis on how workers and economic justice play into our kind of understanding of what changes our politics. And so, I think it's really just an honor to be here to kind of put our heads together, having done so since Forge began, and look forward to your questions toward the end.
Fantastic, thank you. Ellen, why don't you wrap us up? Who are you? What are you focusing on? And tell us a bit about your work.
Who am I? I guess I have spent 30 plus years, embarrassingly, I'm reflecting on my age, working at the nexus of human rights and the environment as an academic, as an activist, and as a funder. I serve as the executive director of the Wallace Global Fund. We're a DC-based progressive family foundation where corporate accountability and movement building are cross-cutting principles to our work on human rights, climate, democracy, and new economic models. We work globally and in the US and in sub-Saharan Africa. And we also use our grants and our investment capital as tools to support strategies that are aligned with social movements and the social movements we support.
All right, fantastic. So you all see this incredible group of colleagues that I work with in the philanthropic world, and why I pulled them into this discourse today. I see 145 attendees, and I hope we have a lot of comments that come through on the chat. Use those emojis, put in your thoughts, your questions. We'll try to pull so many in as we go through the dialogue. But let me kick things off with Daria and Ellen. And to both of you, when you look back at this last decade, using the marker of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and other developments that have emerged, what do you see as key takeaways? What's your sense of progress on the agenda of ensuring business accountability and responsibility for human rights? Ellen, maybe I can start with you, and then Daria will come to you.
Great, thanks so much. I really am honored to be here, and I guess as maybe a uncomfortable elder statesman role right now in the funding community in this space, I'm going to make a few introductory remarks to sort of set the stage. 3 remarks. The first is that we have made tremendous progress in the last year in this business and human rights corporate accountability space. But it's important to see what shifts occurred prior to this last decade that led to the development of what is both a field of business and human rights and a movement demanding corporate accountability for human rights and environmental impacts, and created the conditions for the development and adoption of the guiding principles. Just quickly, there was an explosion of corporate power, growth in corporate power in the 90s as a result of unbridled neoliberalism. It led the human rights field to begin to look upstream at the drivers of human rights abuses, pressing for shifts in traditional methods and strategies for advocacy, and a reprioritization of emphasis from reacting to abuses to preventing them. And by doing that, the 2 or 3 most significant drivers that were identified as tied directly to corporate and economic interests and increasingly to government collusion or failure to protect against these abuses were very much around the extraction or exploitation of natural resources or the production of goods and the supply chain supporting it. Secondly, the intensification of corporate power and its impacts at the community level was met with an explosion of civil society and community-based resistance. One iconic fight in the Niger Delta that resulted in the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other Agoni 8 elevated a nascent movement working at the nexus of human rights, environment, and corporate power into global solidarity and strategic activism, demanding system change and targeting corporations directly, as well as government's responsibility to provide adequate, standards and oversight. Now, let's be clear. These community activists working around the world weren't human rights activists or development activists or environment activists. They were defenders of their communities fighting exploitation, pollution, injustice, and government capture. This movement precipitated collaboration of NGOs across sectors, development of new strategies, demand for new standards, the use of litigation, advocacy for new national policies that demanded disclosure and accountability by corporations for human rights and environmental impacts. And it led to the development of new rights that sat at the nexus of human rights and the environment. Nonetheless, philanthropy was still lagging. The funding community was still really providing only relatively small levels of support for frontline advocacy and movement building for the corporate power work, typically funding more of the traditional defenders work, supporting defenders, efforts in so-called transitional societies, more technocratic research and policy interventions. So now we sit in a moment where philanthropy and the growing movement is confronting 3 really important trends over this last decade that I believe require fundamentally different approaches and different funding strategies. We have new norms in place, new collaborations, and new tools to be used and build on. But we are confronting unprecedented concentration of monopoly capital and corporate capture, the veering to fascism and authoritarian regimes characterized by the emergence of state and economic interests. We're confronting a climate emergency driven by the combustion and use of fossil fuels that is now creating a human rights tsunami and with devastating impacts to come. And third, and finally, we're seeing an explosion of social movements in unprecedented ways, never seen in the world in at least 40 years, if not further. And they're centering racial justice. They're demanding system change and accountability for economic failures. They're working across what has been seen as historic silos and sectors, environment, labor, indigenous, women's rights, development, and demanding systemic change strategies. Given the urgency, last thing I'll say, and given the growth in movement advocacy, as a result, on a positive side, we're seeing efforts within society to meet these challenges, and we're seeing philanthropy respond. And you're going to learn about really interesting efforts like Forge today. But on the more challenging side, philanthropy still largely works in its historic silos, still veers towards technocratic and traditional interventions rather than supporting systemic change, and rarely has a power analysis, what it would take to weaken corporate power and build countervailing power at scale. And there's still limited flows of money going to support movements on the front lines and their collaboration across communities. So I think we have a lot to strategize about, and we have very little time left to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ellen, for kicking us off with that. Daria, let's build on that. I know that last bit that Ellen said about the focus on frontline communities and building their collaboration is something that you very much hold true to the approach of SAGE. But tell us a bit about what your historic perspective is looking back on this decade. What do you see as your key takeaways, and what's your sense of progress in this arena?
Yeah, thank you, Amal. And just like my friend John, it's very hard to follow Ellen Dorsey. She just jumps right up on the barricade. And so I'm going to come in and do a little bit of a different job here. So the question about the, like, sort of looking back, right, sort of taking stock. And I appreciate that for the UN Forum this year, there was this stock taking exercise to look at the past decade. And I think the first thing that I would say is that in looking back over the past decade, it's important to note and reflect on the interrelationship between the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles, and the treaty. And there's a tension, sort of a creative tension and a complementarity between them. And I think that the two processes actually fuel each other. And I think it's worth just spending a moment thinking about that. So the little bit of history here going even before the last 10 years, and Ellen, I really appreciate that, the longevity of your work in the field, and mine too. So beginning in the early 2000s with the UN Subcommission on Human Rights, there were the draft norms on responsibilities of transnational corporations. And these were seen as laying the groundwork for a treaty. But that process was decelerated. And instead, the SRSG was given a mandate, ultimately producing the UNGPs, laying out the non-binding principles that business and government should follow, but delegating implementation for them to national governments, multilaterals, and even businesses themselves. So there's a key outcome from the UNGP process, which is that there's a recognition of the human rights responsibilities of business. So we're no longer debating whether business has responsibilities, but what are they, how far they extend, and how to operationalize them. So this is significant progress, right, over this past decade. But while this is a big step forward in advancing the business and human rights agenda, in its progress, it highlights what's missing or what key gaps still need to be addressed. So notably, it's the non-binding nature of these responsibilities versus mandatory rules or enforceable frameworks. It's also the focus on policy and best practice instead of providing a forum for accountability and remedy. And following on that point, a forum primarily for states, business, and civil society partners, but not for those most impacted. So communities, workers, movements. So again, there's a creative tension between the UNGPs and the treaty, which can be seen here, because shortly after the UNGPs were adopted, the treaty process is launched, and with an elevated focus on remedy and accountability, perhaps the most important element that was missing or was underdeveloped. In the stock-taking exercise that I mentioned for this forum, there's a recognition that many, if not most, of the barriers in accessing remedy identified in the UNGPs still largely remain. So there's a need to both strengthen that third pillar and to advance the treaty process going forward. And that's sort of the larger backdrop I see that leads us to this moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now let me close Ellen and Daria with a question. Ellen kind of hit this, but I really want to, you two are the elder, I call you the OGs of philanthropy, because elder is perhaps, anyway.
I'll take OG.
Okay,
I'll definitely take OG.
You've been in the trenches for a while, all right? So what do you think of the role of philanthropy to date? How have we shown up? Have we shown up enough? And maybe Daria will go with you, and then we'll close with Ellen. I'll move on to the next set of questions.
I wish you'd gone with Ellen first on that one, I have to say. So, I mean, so first of all, I think, Ellen did a really great job of laying out the role of philanthropy and its approach to these issues and the shortcomings of that for a very long time. I would say that I think, sort of on a positive note, in recent years, I think there's an acceleration to catch up and to focus on movements and to focus on strategies from the ground up. I also think we've hit some dead ends, just given the sort of changes in closing democratic space, et cetera, closing civic space. There's, some of the more traditional methods, tools, approaches have not yielded results. And there was a sort of you're forced to reflect and pivot. But maybe let me, take your question, Amal, on the role of philanthropy here more directly. So I think the role of philanthropy can be most constructive when it provides a demonstration effect or leans into key issues or approaches that are not taken up by the primary actors or system. So in that way, it can help strengthen the system response, and it can expand the sort of who's included in generating that response. So in this discussion, recognition that over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of energy going into identifying and disseminating best practices for business, for example, which is a positive development. However, philanthropy has stepped in, and a lot more recently, to fill in some key gaps and provide a wraparound. So leveraging its position and resources to support affected communities and workers, highlighting gaps in accountability, and developing stronger rules and enforcement. And you can see this in the momentum around mandatory human rights due diligence, as well as advancements in binding agreements in the labor rights field. So a big shout out to our colleagues from labor rights. If you look at the Accord, the Fair Food Program, the Lesotho Agreement, and the model propelled by the WSR network and others. So to bring it home here, so the role of philanthropy at SAGE, in 2018, we began supporting a set of enforcement strategies. So where there's been a favorable ruling in a corporate accountability case, but the judgment has been poorly enforced or not enforced at all, and depriving communities of remedy. And my colleague for these many years, and one of our great thought partners, Tricia Feeney, has led this work. Our goal is to provide support, financial and other forms, for groups to pilot robust strategies, target enforcement, and share their experiences with other impacted communities, movements, activists, and lawyers in the field. So ultimately, the goal is to close those gaps around remedy. And if we and our partners are successful, this will help contribute to the overall trajectory of the UNGPs, the treaty, and other initiatives. Maybe if I have time, or you want me to stop there?
If you don't mind, because we're going to go to Ellen and then.
All right, and if we have time, then I'll come back.
I'll come back to you.
Example that'd be
There's a
great to
bunch
highlight.
of squares that still need to speak. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you for that, Daria. Really powerful, and thanks for those interventions. Ellen, take us to the role of philanthropy and your thoughts on it. Have we shown up enough?
We may not be showing up enough, and we may not be showing up in the ways that are needed, fit for purpose in the urgent time frame that we have left. So 5 or 6 quick headlines. 1, we must center justice, racial, economic, and gender justice in everything we do, in our analysis, in our strategies, in how we operate as foundations. Do what it takes to learn how to change your culture, or you will not be relevant. Your work will not be relevant. 2, we must work intersectionally to reflect the intersectionality of movements, shake the silos in your foundation, break down the walls. Don't have a climate program there and a human rights program over there. 3rd, we must support system change strategies coming from the ground. Look for the strategies that movements are promulgating. They have the right answers, and fund them. Fund movements. It's not hard. It requires a different approach than traditional NGO funding, but there are ways to do it, and learn from the funders that have been doing it. Then let's really get where it's hard. Let's talk about power, understanding power, and understanding how power pervades everything that we do. And so you have to have a power analysis, and you have to build power to confront power. Give more. Most donors made 15 to 20% returns in the market with their investments, and they're giving out 5%. That is immoral at a time when we're confronting such tremendous problems around the world. You have no business growing your endowment right now. Last point, you're part of the system. You invest in corporations that either drive the problems or help solve them. And if you are invested in the companies that are driving the problems and committing human rights abuses, use your investments either to withdraw from them or demand change. But you can't pretend you're not part of that system. So we have a lot of tools, and they're not being deployed at scale in the time frame or with the robust resources that the moment requires.
Great. Okay. Thank you to my first OGs for kicking us off. They're wonderful work that you're all doing, and such an inspiration to be in this space with you. I'm now going to pivot to our second set of fireside conversationalists, and that is Keneal Malik and John Jacoby. Approach the fire, please. Here's the question that I have for you. When you look at where we are today with your grantees and the issues that they're working on, what's your sense of their challenges, their needs and opportunities? With efforts to embed rules and regulations like MHRDD gaining traction, cite to Patricia Jurowitz's question in the chat, what do you think is missing or that could use more work, scrutiny, or support? John, if you could kick us off, and then I'll invite Keneal to offer her reflections as well.
Thanks. It's a great question, Amol, and lots of ones in the chat weaving us in. Let me start with a hero for many of us, Nelson Mandela. His autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, has a page about how he was able to sneak the Economist magazine past the prison guards on Robben Island. And the notion was the prison guards were blocking any and all political material to Nelson Mandela and to his comrades at Robben Island in the prison. What they could do was sneak the Economist in by virtue of being about economics. And the point here is he understood, and we need to understand how our economics so often drives and so deeply drives our politics. And that kind of explains, why is OSF even in this space? Why are we supporting these movements now? Why have we co-founded Forge with our colleagues on this call and beyond? It's because democracy needs to deliver for people and planet. We need to think through it not as democracy in some idealized and abstract sense, but as concrete delivery of economic well-being and of truly sustainable and just development at the speed and scale we require. And that's facing the climate crisis. That's facing a crisis for democracy, for legitimacy of democracies to function. Very much a discussion for us. So in terms of then how we come into the space around business and human rights, corporate accountability, where we've leaned in and where it relates most to our set of grantees, at least as it's been, as OSF continues to evolve, we go to new places, but as it's been, coming up with real rules and tools to put human rights at the center of business means a lot, this paradigm shift from a voluntary CSR, corporate social responsibility paradigm that arguably we've been within for the last 30 years of this era of globalization, and a pivot that takes time and looks different in different places and in different moments, but to a pivot to the mandatory, to the necessary steps that governments need to take for the speed and scale required to address human rights and democratic crises, to address the climate crisis in the time we have on those fronts. So it's really no more business as usual. We can't stay within a voluntary piecemeal CSR approach. It's kind of an efficiency argument to look for where we can have enforceable public policies, enforceable private contracts, strategic litigation that then draws on the tools, right? Draws on the due diligence laws to develop cases, draws on the private contracts, for example, the enforceable brand agreements like the Bangladesh Accord and its new successor, the International Accord, and then to drive these changes at scale. And so where we've supported is just, you can see across the globe, some of those laws, we've seen them proliferating in Europe, and we're very excited to see where some of our investments alongside many Forge partners are trying to get us over a strong and effective finish line with what's happening in the EU level, building on French, German, Dutch and other laws, where it embeds in terms of cases. We've been excited to support groups like Prodesk in terms of where Alejandra spoke earlier today at the forum around using the French law to drive a case in Mexico that would then address community concerns in Unión Hidalgo. Accountability Council using tools that are non-judicial in nature but need to be driven across the international development agencies and banks. Poder, also in Mexico, addressing a remedy for communities affected by the largest environmental spill in Mexican history. In South Africa, the Center for Environmental Rights, stopping a coal-fired power plant on the basis of human rights instruments, including the UNGPs and other instruments to drive investors to think twice about where they're investing. These cases, alongside, again, the big push for due diligence that we see across Europe with ripple effects beyond, the enforceable private contracts, we can start to build a model at scale that will take us this decade to get there, but that kind of comprises some of our vision, again, alongside a number of partners to get to a place where we have true governance of human rights issues in the global economy. A second frontier, and highly related, is then the question of financial leverage and financial power. We need both political power and policy to drive change at scale, and we need the financial system and investors within it, where trillions of dollars are at play in the global economy and flowing to then be driven by environmental, social, and governance, right, or ESG criteria to address the long-term impacts on the bottom line. So just as a very concrete example there, alongside Forge partners like Humanity United, Wallace Global, Laudes Foundation, OSF was really proud to put seed capital toward the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, right? We've now seen trillions of dollars of assets, of asset managers and owners coming together to develop an understanding of human rights due diligence, to convey it to the investor community, and then to think about this sort of three-legged stool of investor leverage of their own responsibility and even their accountability, right, on these human rights outcomes, again, as a financial driver alongside the political drivers to get business and human rights aligned, right? That's where we're going there. Finally, just on a third and again, always related area that we've really supported as OSF across a number of programs, thematic and geographic, is on this nexus of worker rights, climate justice, corporate accountability, and also corporate activism, where it does speak up to lose question, and looking at global supply chains and not looking at it as of 20 years ago, but looking at it in the context of the pandemic, the recovery, all of the flaws in our global supply chain model. What can be done in this moment of true crisis and opportunity to drive changes in how business and government treat workers, get their heads around what needs to be done to address the climate crisis. And within that, we look at how workers' rights has been significantly a focus for governments around forced labor and child labor. They are crucial, egregious labor rights abuses to address as we see them. We just need to also build in the core enabling rights that kind of connect the workplace to the wider societies. Those are freedom of association, of assembly, collective bargaining, right? How labor rights defenders are at their best, human rights defenders who are changing the way their societies address rights questions and transition to democracy. And global supply chains are one lever by which we can draw on the movement for corporate accountability and for business and human rights to drive better changes for workers, and how the labor movement itself in many places can be more representative and more intersectional with the other movements, so that we see true changes that drive it for indigenous communities in terms of climate justice and in their own livelihoods and so on. So I will leave it there.
Thanks, Sean.
And
Yeah.
go from there. Thanks, Amal.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Keneal, I would love for you to come in here and to challenge the sort of the question I asked, which is, what are you hearing from your grantees of the sense of their challenges and the opportunities you see before them? And I'll also say, Keneal, I'm always struck by your perspective, because as when I first met you, you said, I'm a daughter of the Global South and I bring that lens to my work. I just wonder if you could also share a bit about your reflections on where we're not maybe focusing our energy enough outside of what I see Sean calling out here, the focus on Western companies and EU companies. Tell us a bit about what you're seeing from your vantage point and the partners you're working with outside of the sort of North American Euro bubbles.
I'm happy to do so, Amal. And Sean, thank you so much for your comments. And there are a lot of really rich comments in the chat, and I hope we get to them. I'd probably break down my response into 3 categories. So one is where the need meets the opportunity. I sometimes like to not think about our grantees and all the challenges they're facing, because these are resilient groups and people and organizations who've been doing this work for a long time. And so they just see a challenge as an opportunity. Then a little bit about mandatory human rights due diligence and some of the, it's a toolbox, but what's missing from the toolbox, who made the toolbox? I think we really need to ask hard questions there, and how can we enrich that toolbox? And then a little bit about philanthropy and what's not being said, and the things that don't get spoken, and the things that are not being boldly spoken about. So the first part of it, going to need meeting opportunity. Some of the things our grantees point out is they say that there are, while there's a lot of, there's not enough, but there's movement around corporate accountability and remedy and consequences, et cetera. Sometimes, unless they can frame their work in a corporate accountability, mold, it doesn't get seen as corporate accountability work, right? So when some of our groups are working on plastic law and saying, look, these groups that are in Bangladesh and NGOs in Uganda, and they're the ones holding petrochemical companies accountable for what's going into water, what gets transported back to their countries and dumped in their countries. I don't think you can ask for a better example of corporate accountability, but it doesn't get seen like that. You know what I mean? And so there's a blind spot there, and it exists within philanthropy, saying, well, if it's not the mold that we're used to seeing, then we just don't identify it as such. So they're telling us about that. They're also telling us about the lack of support for the non-sexy things, I would say, technical support, right? The need to support ecological economists, agronomists, people who can look at resettlement agreements and say, look, this is messing with the land, life, and livelihood of communities who are having their land being grabbed. And then we have other groups that we support who are actually saying, look, what are the blind spots? What are the things that are not being called corporate accountability? I really appreciated the work that IDI did on the car industry and the aluminum industry, but there are many other blind spots as well, and they're a group that we support. And also I want to name the absence of a significant amount of corporate accountability funding going to Indigenous people's rights. When you look at the number of Indigenous people's groups that are on the front line fighting, copper multinational corporations, other kinds of metal mining, whether it's in Russia and elsewhere, they're doing a phenomenal job. Really escalating work on campaigns that are just from the ground up, and a lot of that work is not being adequately supported. The next thing I'll point out is that part of what we try to do is also identify groups that are outside of the EU, right? So that means supporting a natural justice, Southern Africa Trust, FEDEV, Greenwatch, supporting those groups who are saying, look, let's train judges and jurists so that when they get a climate justice case in their sphere in Uganda, in the Cameroon, they are not using tort law and administrative law to deal with a climate justice issue. And if we don't, in the philanthropic world, think of those things as corporate accountability, that's a huge blind spot, and we're not actually serving these groups. So we need to listen instead of talking as much as we do. The next thing I'd say, I think there's a phenomenal amount of work going on with mandatory human rights due diligence. We see the limitations of that, though. We see what's happening in Germany when the proposed MHRDD law, and in France is the successful one. But we also see that there's tightness. A lot of this is still in the realm of tort law, administrative law, some of it's really consumer law. And while I think that's all very good, we need to kind of get out of the box of thinking about this as uniquely, as even if it's not meant to be, it still has a very European sense to it. So we really need to be really careful about making sure that one of the things I know we try to do actively is say, when we're talking with the groups that we support, who do phenomenal work, Sherpa, ECCJ, Frank Bold, all of those groups, we say, okay, we ask the question, so what are the Latin American groups who are giving you input on this? Who are the Caribbean environmental justice groups who are advocating and saying this aspect of this law, this framework works for us or doesn't translate well? And they can answer good questions. They give us good answers to those, and some other groups, I think, might not be able to give good answers to those. And so that's part of the philanthropic push. We actually see that as part of true partnership. The last thing I'll say is just kind of naming the things that continue to go unsaid. I know that you, at least the folks on this call, as the speakers would know, will have heard of the really good Washington International Law Journal written by Erica George, Jenna Martin, and Tara Van Hout talking about a reckoning, a dialogue about racism and anti-racism and business and human rights. And I think we continue to need to not only sit comfortably at the intersections, but really embrace them. We need to name climate justice as a corporate accountability issue. We need to name racial justice as a corporate accountability and human rights issue. We need to talk about corporate accountability in the framework of remedy, repair, right? Because that repair to relationships, and also about reparations. And we need to be really, really honest about the disservice we're doing to Indigenous communities when we actually don't give the amount of funding that these groups deserve. You can, in many ways, you could think of Indigenous peoples as some of the first corporate accountability advocates, because they had to stand up and actually say, look, this is what business, this is what the corporate body has done to our land, has done to our ancestors. And so at True Cost, we try to name those things and not speak in corporate accountability speak, but to actually do intersectionality, to actually do relationships, and to do listening, which I think is the most important thing we can do as philanthropists.
Love that. Okay, thank you so much, Camille and John, for those interventions. We're going to move to our third and final set of panelists, and then we'll try to open it up to pull in a few questions, and then we'll do that rapid fire round that I said at the end. But really such a rich conversation thus far, and I think really hitting on some of the questions that our attendees are asking themselves from us and from each other. So I'm really encouraging that chat to keep on happening as we're going through the discussions today. It seems like all of our panelists are indeed reading and following along and adjusting their remarks to fit. So my final panelists that I'm going to invite up to the fire are Greg and Karen. And I've asked you to sort of look forward and tell us what trends are emerging that you seem excited about. What's on the horizon that we need to get ready for as philanthropists and as the broader community? And then Karen, really, we're also here to celebrate the launch of Forge, which happened last year, but also Karen's appointment as the coordinator of Forge and our leader. So Karen's going to talk to us a bit more about what Forge is. And folks here, please do continue to engage because it is a collaboration between all of us. So Greg, why don't you kick us off? What trends are you seeing and what gets you excited?
Sure, great, thanks so much. I'm going to try to skim real quick across a bunch of them. First, there's a lot of attention, obviously, to the human rights due diligence framework that's being pushed in Europe, and it is an exciting one. And I would say two things that are really vital for it. One is it can't be a box ticking exercise. It can't be a reporting framework. It has to be an accountability framework, right? And there's a lot still to be decided about what it's going to look like and what it's going to mean. And there's obviously a lot of great work being done by civil society in France, where this approach was pioneered, to make sure that the reports themselves are meaningful and the due diligence approach is taken, and that there's real accountability when the due diligence approach fails, as it often does. So I think there's a lot to be decided and a lot to be pushed for to make sure it's effective in Europe and in any other countries that follow it. And secondly, look, the due diligence framework exists because there's an accountability gap, right? At the same time as we're investing in the parent company accountability, we have to be continuing to try to strengthen accountability at the local and national level so that communities can access justice and remedy and protection in their own countries and with local courts and with local mechanisms, right? And you have lots of great examples of this, right? You have civil society coming together to try to do this. You've got a regional litigation initiative in West Africa on corporate accountability, the Public Interest Law Initiative for West Africa. You've got very strong corporate accountability coalitions at the African level. There's a strong one in Uganda, the Uganda Consortium for Corporate Accountability. You've got emerging efforts on corporate accountability in Latin America. And there's a lot there that we could be supporting that really is good. We're not going to get all the way to corporate accountability and protection of human rights at the local level, staying at the multinational level. And I think that addresses a little bit the question of actors coming from outside of Europe as well and outside of North America. Secondly, I'd just come back to the treaty as a space that, it's good to see that getting some real attention here at the forum. It's a space that movements and NGOs in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere have really coalesced around. And if you ask, if you talk to ACA, the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, about something that's really sort of motivated their members and they've really been able to organize around, the treaty is one of it, is really it comes up a lot. So thirdly, I think there's a danger in a lot of these spaces, going back to some of the points that Daria made at the beginning, that they're just going to fail to address these massive accountability gaps if they don't focus on rights, to use the technical language, rights holders, workers, communities, and others, and are led and shaped by business, right? Business is the reason that we have this space is because of the kinds of crises that Ellen has underlined, right? Because of the kinds of abuses that are, frankly, unfortunately, central to the operations of the global economy today. And if we take our cues from business rather than from rights holders, I think we're gonna keep making the same mistakes that we've been making for 20, 30 years, and I don't think we're going to get beyond that. So I think there's really a need to ensure that we're taking our cues from workers and movements and the indigenous communities that Camille mentioned and the like. And I think that's a challenge for spaces like the UN Forum, right? There's my old shop, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, brings together a lot of great knowledge, and is based in London and New York, and takes and organizations like that take a lot of space in these sessions. And I know that I've worked with the folks who organize the UN Forum. I know that it's under resourced. I know you sort of go to the people who have the resources to organize panels, and I continue to have enormous respect for those groups, and we have to work harder to lift up voices directly from affected communities and movements. I just think we're not doing enough. The thing that really shocks me that to look ahead is the next pandemic. I mean, there is such an utter failure of the global governance system and the global health system to separate itself from corporate influence. The fact that under 10% of Africans are fully vaccinated today, when I just got a booster shot, is utterly scandalous. And the reason for that, let's be clear, is because COVAX was led by was completely subsumed within a corporate framework of intellectual property and within the WTO, and there was just not enough space to push back on that. So looking ahead, I mean, we're going to have other pandemics. We see new variants emerge, currently right now. I think there's lots of people-led efforts to create capacity to manufacture vaccines in the global South that won't be tied to these profit motives, and it's just shocking to me that we're not. And there are networks like ESCRnet that are really leading on alternative models to address this. The last thing I'll say, just really quickly, because it came up in the chat, is this question of tax. For a lot of these questions, they're fundamentally resource questions, and we still see an enormous deprivation of countries that are generating wealth for multinationals, whether that's through internet companies like Facebook, where India is the largest market that it has, or mining companies that use things like transfer pricing and other well-known, well-documented tools to extract wealth and not generate it locally for the communities that are affected. There's a real need to confront that as a human rights issue. And in the kinds of scenarios that we're seeing where people are revolting against massive inequality, I think if we stay confined to sort of technical issues that don't touch on these broader questions of inequality, we're going to see our relevance continue to decline. So or really stay very limited and not address these fundamental questions that we're getting at. And that goes to everything. It goes to climate. It goes to the need to have resources for resiliency and adaptation and just transition. Thanks.
Fantastic, Greg, and thanks for weaving in some of the comments from the chat into your remarks. I know you therefore had to hit a bunch of things, but I think you still did it eloquently and tying principles of centering the perspectives of rights holders in the front lines in all of our efforts. So thanks for that message, and maybe we'll come back to some of those points in the chat. Karen, our leader of Forge, there's a lot of chat happening in the questions around the ability of philanthropy in this area to scale resources. I think Chris had a comment in there about the trillions of new commitments coming in, or the billions of new commitments coming into the climate space. Why aren't we seeing that here? What are we doing to organize philanthropy in this area? Can you give us a bit of a briefing on that? And then I'd also love to ask our panelists as we go through this final 15 minutes to reflect in their observations about that question. Really, where's the big money here in this area? So Karen, why don't you tell us about Forge and the work you're doing to help us bring some coherence to collaboration on foundation work here?
Okay, thanks, Amal. I'm going to talk about a few of the strategies that we're developing at Forge. And I think that and try to make connections to some of the excellent points that others have brought up. Anita asked about the connections between corporate accountability and other social issues, climate, how we make those connections. Ellen talked about movements and movement building and making connections between movements. So I'm going to go through a couple of our strategies and try to highlight our intentions around some of those, I think, important questions. So first of all, a primary strategy for Forge and its members is its learning agenda. And this is about the funders around the table having an opportunity to learn from each other about their analysis, their strategies, their grantees, opportunities they see, challenges they face, and so on. But there's also a collective learning agenda. And that learning takes place in different places. It takes place in thematic working groups, one of which we call the Real Rules Group, which is focused on establishing binding rules, regulations, obligations for economic actors. But it also takes place through our grant making. We have a pooled fund at Forge called the Response and Vision Fund. And it has two components very quickly for those who are unaware. The response portion is a very agile funding mechanism that directed resources to groups that were particularly affected by the economic crisis that came out as part of the pandemic. And the Vision Fund has a longer term objective. It seeks to promote system change, to address some of the issues that people have been raising today. We are very shortly, we'll be announcing our inaugural round of grantees for the Vision Fund. And that round of grants is focused on sovereign debt. And this is an issue that very few Forge members are working on, but through our collective reflection and learning process, we came to see the great strategic value of this issue and the connections that people are raising here. So what's happened, of course, during the pandemic is that governments have had to assume increasing debt burdens in an attempt to obtain the resources needed to protect their populations from the pandemic, to secure public health. And servicing these debt burdens has really constrained government's ability to further other public objectives. Things like providing social protections to vulnerable populations, responding to the climate crisis and populations that are vulnerable to climate, transitioning to a low fossil fuel economy, but also it constrains government's ability to regulate economic actors, non-state actors. So we saw very clear strategic connections between sovereign debt and the kind of programmatic objectives, the kind of economic justice objectives that we want to further. And that came out through our collective reflection and learning process. Also to the point about movement building and connections, not only are we looking for strategic economic justice issues that connect to these myriad entry points, there's also a strong intention to do so in a way that strengthens movements and fosters connection. So in our grant making, when we announce the docket, you'll see the round of grants, you'll see that there are very intentional connections between groups that are making the links between government's ability to foster a just transition and the constraints around economic policies like those connected to debt. Another one of our key strategies is around alignment. And the objective here is to really increase the impact of our members' grant making, increase the impact of their work by identifying gaps and leveraging strategic opportunities. What this looks like in practice is funders share information about initiatives, opportunities, proposals that they're funding or that are on their radar where they see there's a need for greater support. Because there's an outstanding gap, there's a strategic opportunity that's not being leveraged as much as it could be. And so that information is shared, and then there is an opportunity for funders to address those gaps. And in this year at Forge, we've had aligned grant making. In this case, again, connects to some of the questions that are coming up in the chat. One funder is supporting plaintiffs and their allies in a lawsuit under the French duty of vigilance law. that those groups required additional support. That was identified, flagged, and other funders around the table were able to step up and support that strategic opportunity. So that's about promoting greater alignment between the work of the funders around the table. The final strategy I want to talk about is an advocacy strategy, which is very much about our voice, about Forge's voice, and raising it and taking public positions that give echo to, that support the demands from our grantees and our partners. And this is, of course, an act of solidarity, but it's also intended to be persuasive. It's also intended to affect change, influence other funders, so the broader philanthropic community, also decision makers, and also non-state actors. This is an area that's in development now, and we hope very shortly to start exercising that muscle. If you pay attention to our website and our Twitter feed, we'll be starting to speak up and take some of those positions and support our grantees. So Amal, very quickly, that's a run through of our principal strategies.
Yeah, and I love that. And Karen, thank you for your leadership in bringing us together. I think what you've heard today, folks, from our panelists is really the perspective of institutions and of leaders in this space. And then really what we wanted to do with Karen at the end is to show we are indeed trying to build power together. I think that the question about whether resources can be aggregated onto this topical area is something we're still challenging our institutions with and trying to lift the amount of commitments that are coming in to support the good work of so many of you on this call, and to try to stitch together the silos that are apparent between communities that have often been working on similar issues, but from different perspectives, the climate movement, the rights movement, et cetera. We're trying to say that corporate accountability in business and human rights is a cross-cutting approach that touches all. So we really are trying to build power together, I think, is the ultimate message here. I'm going to close with, I think our panelists have done a good job of trying to pick up some of the questions. I'm going to do this. I'm going to ask any panelists, if you have a question that you saw that you want to flag and note, just jump in here to do so. And then I'm going to ask you for your closing remarks. We have about 7 minutes total. So if there's only any urgent questions or comments that you saw in the chat that you wanted to lift, please do so now. Just grab the floor. If not, I'll pivot us on.
I'll do two quick. Watch that space. To echo Karen, watch that space for the Summit for Democracy coming up, because we as individual institutions and across potentially across our institutions will be able to speak up around this nexus of worker rights, democracy, business, and human rights issues where possible. Another watch that space quickly is just on this question of ESG, financial power, and some of the risks across. It's very much a push and pull. It's very much a live dynamic. And so looking for where, for example, the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, has already previewed a new platform soon to be launched, and to look at then where we have points in to try and engage and shape and influence as ESG mainstreams, both as risk, but also some tremendous opportunity to center human rights for business and investors. Thanks.
Great. Anyone else? Okay, so here's what I'm going to ask you each to do. We have 5 minutes, and this is your opportunity to leave a lasting message to the 126 attendees that are still on this call and those that will watch the recording of this later. What are your key takeaway messages that you want to leave to this group of leaders in this space? We're going to go maybe reverse order, and Karen, we'll start with you and wind our way back through, please.
Sure. I think that for me, something that attracted me to Forge and that I think is very important about this work is, and others have mentioned this, but rights holders and their allies are facing extremely powerful economic actors. And we're not going to make headway, and we only make headway when we come together and when we build strength and power through unity, through collaboration, through connection, through all paddling in the same direction. And to use too many metaphors. And that's what Forge is attempting to do, to bring philanthropic funders who care about these issues together and to find ways of aligning their work jointly funding their work. And this is something that we're looking for in our grant making. And so I think it was Dari who spoke about demonstration effect. Maybe that's not quite the right way to say it, but we're trying to walk the talk. We're coming together and building strength together. And it's something that we're trying to promote with civil society and rights holders. So for me, I think that's the central piece about this initiative.
Fantastic. Greg, thoughts, last takeaway messages.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one of the transformations that we're trying to drive is real accountability to workers, communities, rights holders, people on the front lines, right? The international NGO space, frankly, is not good at that, right? We are structured as a community largely of experts, and that's true in the human rights space. It's true in the business and human rights space in particular. And I think there's so much we can do, right, to really put workers and communities and social movements, as Ellen has highlighted, which already are organized for accountability and for being driven by people on the front lines, right? You've got people organized around people affected by mining, people affected by dams in Latin America, peasant movements, right? Women's movements, et cetera, right? Those are, and you know, we say we need to break out of their silos. They're not in silos. They are facing the entire range of issues that affect their lives. They are facing those issues, and the only reason they go into silos is because we make them. We in the INGO community, and we in the funder community. So I think, you know, those. The more I see solutions that are driven by those movements, the more credibility that has in my mind.
Fantastic. Okay, Greg, thank you. Camille, over to you. Takeaway messages.
I would say, Amal, and just driven by the rich chat, you know, more listening on behalf of funders and more learning, but also being brave enough to unlearn the things that we know are problematic about the way philanthropy has worked in the past and the way the philanthropic space, especially as it regards to business and human rights, has worked. So we need to be comfortable enough and brave enough to unlearn, and also just to step back and pivot where we need to, understanding how to support gaps, always asking who's not at the table, and really being comfortable being led. We're not supposed to be leaders. At least that's not the way we see it in it. We're supposed to be supporters. We're supposed to be enhancers. We're supposed to be amplifiers where that makes sense and where that's appropriate, but really not taking up more space than we need to.
Thank you for that, Camille. John, over to you. Takeaway messages.
We're cutting across so many fields in Forge, and very proud of how we managed to do so. Silos are a reality of philanthropy, so we're finding our way. I want to talk about something that's out of scope currently for Forge, but it's so important in this arena, which is the question of tech and human rights, the ICT sector. You know, thinking of consumer, citizen, digital users as rights holders. We know that then, you know, so many of us, billions, right, around the world, who are then rights holders that are intensely impacted by surveillance capitalism, by trends that are very much shaping the next 10 years as well, that we've gotten a little less discussion here. So just to say, there was a question about, you know, what does it mean when you go after companies, but also engage their activism where they can be allies in this. The tech sector is so interesting here, where we can see some progressive instincts on some elements, on immigration issues or climate issues, perhaps racial and gender justice issues, all because they face pressure, perhaps because, at least in the United States, there are some progressive elements of the employee base, as well as the way that investors, consumers, and others have shaped the tech industry, but not yet, right, is that sector really getting it on taxation, regulation, unionization. So what can we do to connect the dots to economic justice issues for a very powerful sector we haven't talked about?
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Daria, to you, and then we'll close with Ellen's remarks. Yep, Daria, what are your takeaways?
Corporate power. So I'm just, you know, Ellen kicked it off, and we cannot underscore this enough. If, you know, there's a difference between business and human rights and corporate accountability, and power is the difference. So, you know, corporate power, we need to focus on it in the analysis. We need to focus on it in the responses. We need to focus on it in terms of what we're building, right? So corporate power is what influences, shapes policies, frameworks, rules in a way that benefits private profit over public interest, right? So this requires a power analysis directly targeting where corporations and investors undermine accountability. And this is by design and often legal. So it does not require, we cannot, and it's been mentioned here, we cannot have a technical exercise in response. The technical knowledge and expertise is required, but it's come up in MHRDD that my colleagues were commenting on. It's come up in the chat around ESG. You can't go down a 10-year rabbit hole with a technical methodological exercise. That is required, but that is not going to get us over the line. So, ultimately what we're talking about is binding enforceable standards and rules, otherwise known as regulation with judicial remedy. And that's what we've got to build.
Okay. All right, Ellen, with that, what are your thoughts, takeaways?
Well, first thought and takeaway is thank you, Tomal. This was a great panel and you did a phenomenal job organizing it. And thank you for that. Listen, I'm going to challenge us all as individuals in whatever our role and capacity is. First, no business as usual. Every day we should get up and be thinking about how to change the game rapidly and urgently. We're on the precipice of irreversible change. The climate, the destruction of democratic norms, and the intersection of these crises are causing us to circle around the drain. We have to foster deep collaboration, power building, movement support at scale. Whatever your role is, figure out how to do that. We need to support the leadership of the frontline communities. We need to take risks, look for strategic hacks to the system, not incremental changes. For the funders, I'm sorry, whether you're a program officer or a board member, demand that you give more. It is not right to give the minimal amount. It is not right to invest in the problems. Philanthropy isn't even adopting ESG standards, let alone figuring out how to make them work and actually deliver the results on human rights and the environment. Put 5% of our investments into community hands to build new enterprises, new economic models, resilience. Come on, pull back that wall, donors, between the investments and the grants. And then the last thing I'm going to say, slight modification of my sister Keneal's comments, my comrade, lady funder, that while I think we should step up, but not back, but step up appropriately, understand what our role is, and then drive like crazy. We need to act like everything is at stake because it is. So thank you very much. And let's get our urgent game on.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to everyone for attending today's Fireside Conversation in conjunction with the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. Thank you for Anita for participating here today. I know how busy she is with the forum. We really appreciate your leadership and partnership, Anita, with our community.
Yeah, and all I can say is, can we do this again next year?
Okay, yes, we definitely can.
Yeah.
I know folks here that would love to attend and participate. And let's hope we have some real progress to show next year. Thank you to our participants and our speakers, and really to the attendees who gave up an hour and 15 minutes, now 18 minutes, to attend today's session. Donors, we also should be accountable, and we should be accountable to you. So keep on asking us questions, demanding our responses, and sharing your incredible work with us, because we are trying to do all that we can to keep supporting it. So have a great rest of the week. Please visit forgefunders.org and get to know Karen Keenan, our incredible coordinator. And thank you so much again to our panelists. Wonderful conversation today. The recording will be shared. For those interested, please just email me, or we'll try to send it out through the links as a thank you in the event notification. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.